Tantra Illuminated with Dr. Christopher Wallace is a journey through the depths of the human experience, as viewed through the lens of the tradition called non-dual Shiva Tantra. This multi-format podcast delves into the fascinating world of classical Tantra and its intersections with philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, human development, and the broader world of spirituality. For this episode, I'll be reading the first part of Alexis Sanderson's second article, first published in 1986. This is also an incredible piece of work. It's entitled Mandala and Āgamic Identity in the Trika of Kashmir. Introduction on Initiation. Having traced and colored the mandala of the trident and lotuses, the guru of the Trika installs and worships in it the deities of the sect. He then blindfolds the initiand and leads him into its presence. When the blindfold is removed, the deities of the mandala enter the neophyte in an instantaneous immersion trance, samavesha. Footnote. Here, in the tantrika initiation of the Trika, this immersion trance seems to have been nominal. There is no indication that the initiand was expected to show signs of loss of control. This is in marked contrast to the Kaula initiation of the Trika, in which the ritual was to proceed only if the candidate had entered an immersion trance, and the intensity of this empowerment was to be gauged by the guru from such symptoms as convulsions and loss of consciousness. Clearly, the Kaula Trika was the preserve of virtuosi, while the Tantrika, with which we are exclusively concerned here, enabled the sect to establish itself as a broad-based tradition. Back to the main text. His subsequent life of ritual and meditation is designed to transform this initial empowerment manifest in his membership of the sect into a state of permanent identification to draw it forth as the substance of his conscious mind. Daily recreating the mandala in mental worship, he summons from within his consciousness the deities it enthrones, projecting them onto a smooth mirror-like surface to contemplate them there as the reflection of his internal āgamic identity. He aspires to know himself only as this nexus of deities, constituting for himself an invisible identity concealed within his worldly perception and activity, a heterodox, visionary self of power behind the public appearance of purity sustained by conformity to orthodox society. With Abhinavagupta, the leading expositor of this sect, in the third and final phase of its evolution, we see the metaphysical translation of this āgamic deity-self. He defines it as the absolute autonomy of a non-individual consciousness which alone exists, containing the whole of reality within the bliss of a dynamic I nature, projecting space, time, and the interrelating fluxes of subjective and objective phenomena as its content and form, manifesting itself in this spontaneous extroversion through precognitive impulse, cognition, and action, icha, jnana, and kriya, as the three radical modes of an infinite power. The mandala is enabled to define and transmit this omnipotent I through the identification of these modes with the goddesses Para, Parapara, and Apara, who are enthroned as the heart of the mandala on the three lotuses that rest upon the tips of its central trident. In worshipping them, the initiate is to rehearse the liberating intuition that his true self is the undifferentiated deity ground, which contains this triad of impersonal powers in blissful omnipotential fusion. Chidananda Sanghataha. Through the internal monologue of his ritual, he is to banish the I of his identity in the world of mutually exclusive subjects and objects, projecting onto the mirror of the mandala the vision of a super-self whose form contains not only this I, but all I's, and the world of objects and values by which these I's believe themselves to be conditioned. His ritual and his meditation serve to create a mental domain in which the boundaries which hem in his lower public self are absent. Through constant repetition, they are to transform this visionary projection, or bhavana, into a subjective identity known a priori, that is, prior to conceptual thought. Thinking of his lower social subjectivity from within as the contraction of the infinite power of his true āgamic self, he ritually internalizes a metaphysical ontology. Yet this view of reality is at the same time the expression of sectarian power. The metaphysical translation of the configuration of deities with which it empowers his identity absolutizes his self-representation, not only because it denies existence to anything other than this self, but also because it de-absolutizes the metaphysical grounds and deity selves that empower the sect's rivals in revelation. Through the ritual in which he internalizes the āgamic self of the Trika, he is made to see that these opposing claims to supremacy form a concentric hierarchy of truth emanation, in which the Trika is the innermost core and material cause. The plurality of competing doctrines is dissolved into the concept of an internally unified word absolute, paravak, which is identical with the self-projecting autonomy of the Trika's triadic deity self. Emanating through its three powers, in a series of progressive contractions from the absolute light of all-inclusive consciousness to the banal plurality of the common world, it assumes between these extremes the form of the various systems of salvation or esoteric power, which the Trika sees around itself. Just as it illustrates itself upon the mirror of consciousness as the hierarchy of ontic levels, or tattvas, from Shiva to inert matter, so it expresses itself scripturally in absolutizations of these levels. Thus it is that the mental construction and worship of the mandala and its deities in daily worship is encoded to signal the Trika Shaiva's ascent through and beyond the levels of this emanation of doctrines in consciousness. Passing through the deity structures of the lower Shaiva revelations, in the highest reaches of this ascent, in the zone of the word's first stirring towards self-differentiation, he reaches the conviction of omniscience and omnipotence in the core of the three goddesses of his sect enthroned above the trident. The mandala and its powers, the throne and the enthroned, become the emblem of his sect's dominion over the universe of self-reference, the scriptural word essence which entered him through his initiation, lifting him out of its coarser modalities into the Trika, speaks with ever-increasing clarity and consistency as the continuum of his ritual and meditation, until at last it falls silent in unquestioning self-knowledge. Footnote. For Abhinavagupta, all ritual and worship is vikalpa samskara, the inculcation through repetition of the āgamic revelation of the nature of the self. When such a truth perception develops by the power of thought alone, without the additional support of action, then the means of self-realization, the upaya, is the intermediate one called Shakta upaya or Jnana upaya. When this truth perception is unable to develop unaided, and so goes for support to visualization practices, concentration on the source of the breath, the cycling of sounds in the breath, external and internal postures, and the activation of micro-macrocosmic correspondences in the breath, the body, and the external supports of ritual, then the means is the lower one termed Anava Upaya, or Kriya Upaya. This self-creation through contemplation, bhavana, with or without further support, is transcended only in the highest means, the Shambhava Upaya, or Icha Upaya, in which one intuits one's āgamic identity within the precognitive impulse of pure will, Icha. The wordless revelation achieved here directly is the goal or culmination of the stream of vikalpa samskara, refinement of understanding, in the two lower methods. It is the point at which repetition becomes unbroken continuity, in which one has become what one says one is. Back to the main text. The Mandala in daily worship. Preliminaries. Having performed ritual purification, the initiate proceeds to his sanctum, his yaga girha. Standing outside it, he consubstantiates his hands and body with Shiva and his Shakti by installing in his hands and body the mantras of Matrika and Malini. This is called the basic nyasa. He then installs the same mantras in a wine-filled chalice, and with its contents sprinkles the ingredients of worship, thus drawing them within the power of Shiva. Next he makes an offering to the retinue of deities that surrounds the site, and to the deities that guard the entrance to the sanctum. He then takes a flower, empowers it with the force of the weapon mantra, casts it in through the door to expel all malevolent powers, enters, directs about the interior a gaze which blazes with the radiance of Shiva, prevents entry into the area with the armor mantra, and sits down facing north. 2. The deification of the body. Now he purifies his body with the weapon mantra, visualizing its power as a fire sweeping up through his body and reducing it to ashes. He then dispels these ashes with the wind of the armor mantra. The process of incineration is to be understood by the worshipper as the destruction of his public or physical individuality, and the blowing away of the ashes as the eradication of the deep latent traces or samskaras of this binding identification. He is to see that all that remains of his identity is pure undifferentiated consciousness as the impersonal ground of his cognition and action. So doing, he opens the way for his identification with the deity through the mantras that follow. His ritual has removed the identity which impedes this immersion. This invocation of the āgamic self into the place of his now absent individuality is accomplished in 2 stages. First, he installs the mantra of somatization, identifying it with the primal urge towards the assumption of form that rises up within the waveless void of his now de-individualized consciousness. The mantra's verbal form is the worshipper's assertion that this power is now his identity. As he utters it, he becomes the deity-self in its internal, still undifferentiated potentiality, as the seed of cosmic expansion. In the next stage, he expands this foundation self by infusing through touch into the parts of his body the whole series of deities which he will later worship in the internal Mandala. This is Vishesha Nyasa, the special installation. Seeing them as the cosmic extroversion of this innermost I. This structure of deities in the form of mantras is mantrically translated through numerical equivalences into the 36 ontic levels that constitute the Shiva totality, the tattvas, from Shiva to earth. His body thus divinized as the all-containing absolute. He worships it with flowers, incense, and the like. This whole procedure, from incineration to this worship, is then repeated on a wine-filled chalice. As before, he consubstantiates the ingredients of worship with the worshipped by sprinkling them with the contents of the divinized chalice, and then repeats with these ingredients the worship of himself as the cosmic deity, Atma Puja. 3. The installation of the Trishulabja Mandala in internal sensation, or prana. A. The 4 levels of immersion, samavesha. Now that he has established Shiva's cosmic expansion in his body, he is qualified to proceed to the next phase, the mental construction of the mandala, as the first stage of internal worship, antaryaga. That this internal worship should be preceded by the deification of the body accords with the general tantric principle that only one who has become the deity may worship the deity. Abhinavagupta's Trika, however, sees this within the categories of the doctrine of recognition, the Pratyabhijñā Shastra, developed by his teacher's teacher Utpaladeva. According to that doctrine, the all-containing self appears as the limited self by manifesting its contraction through 4 levels, as a sensationless void, shunya, as internal sensation, antarasparsha, which is at the level of prana, then as the mind, and finally the body. Immersion, samavesha, is the absence of this subordination of one's essence to these projections. It is, says Utpaladeva, that state in which the pure agency of consciousness reasserts itself within those levels, revealing their dependence upon it. For Abhinavagupta, commenting on Utpaladeva's formulation, all acts of worship are modes of this immersion. To make obeisance, pranama, to hymn, to make offerings, and to contemplate, all induce identity with the deity through the submergence of the field of individualized consciousness within the body, mind, prana, and the void. In the present case, the performer of the liturgy is to understand that the phase of the ritual up to the worship of his body has accomplished this immersion in the lowest of these levels, that of the body, and the installation of the Trishulabja Mandala and the mental worship of the deities upon it, which now follows, will perfect this immersion by establishing it in the three higher levels: the mind or stream of cognition, the internal sensation or prana, and the sensationless void. This is to be achieved by visualizing the mandala within the second level, that of the prana. The other two levels, the mind below it and the void above it, are held to be divinized automatically in this visualization, being elements internal to the action. The void as the locus of the agent, acting on internal sensation and therefore above it, and the mind as his instrument. B. The level of internal sensation, or prana. This level gives life to self-consciousness in the mind and the body, but is itself independent of them. Trika soteriology teaches access to it through the centering of awareness in the point of equilibrium within the gross movement of inhalation and exhalation. The stronger the centering, the weaker this movement becomes, and as the breath evaporates, so does identification with the body and the mind, since these modes of self are held to be entirely dependent on breathing. Internal sensation is reached when this oscillation of the breath has become so faint that its two movements are fused in a subtle, pulsating point of quintessential vitality, in the I as it subsists in dreamless but blissful sleep. If the practice is sustained at this stage, then awareness penetrates the sensationless void in its core, and passing through this final barrier, enters the pulsation of autonomous consciousness, also known as the Shakta Spanda. The fused breath is totally dissolved, and the fire of the rising breath blazes up from below the navel. Devouring all duality, it ascends through a central vertical channel, penetrating the cranial aperture of Brahma, to culminate as Shiva consciousness, at a point 12 finger widths directly above the crown, the Dwadashanta point. In the present phase of our ritual, the level of inner sensation underlying the movement of inhalation and exhalation is extended in imagination along the central channel, and the Trishulabja Mandala is projected in ascending stages along it. Trishulabja Mandala literally means the mandala of trident and three lotuses. Thus the worshipper evokes through ritual the actual yogic rise of the liberating central power known as Kundalini. Indeed, he is to aspire to experience it in the ritual itself. For in mentally installing the mandala and worshipping its deities, he should enter the mudra. This is not a hand pose, the common sense of the term, but a yogic trance of a kind, an inner posture, a karana, in which the virtual divinization of the trans-intellectual levels is actualized by ascent through the cranial aperture to the Dwadashanta, so that the mandala, the deities, and the worshipper are fused. C. The mandala throne. The Trishulabja Mandala is built up along the axis of internal sensation, to contain the complete hierarchy of the Shiva cosmos as the throne of the Trika's deities. In the space of 4 fingers below his navel, he installs the swelling at the trident's base, and makes obeisance to it as the power which supports the universe, Adhara Shakti. He then divides it into 4 levels, and worships these in ascent, seeing them as the 4 material elements, earth, water, fire, and wind, with the 5th space contained in each. Above the swelling, through 30 finger spaces from his navel to the aperture at the back of his palate, he visualizes the staff of the trident rising through the next 25 tattvas, from the subtle objects of sense to the factors which limit consciousness in the individual, tattvas 6 through 30. Above the aperture in the palate, he visualizes the knot, the granthi, and identifies it with Maya, the material cause of the tattvas that constitute the lower, impure universe. Between this knot and the cranial aperture, he visualizes the plinth, and identifies it with pure gnosis, Shuddha Vidya, the first tattva of the pure universe, which rises above Maya to culminate in Shiva. On this plinth, and just below his cranial aperture, he installs the 8-petaled lotus of Gnosis, the Vidya Padma, as the 33rd tattva, that of Shiva in his form as Ishvara. The worshipper now installs in its center Sadashiva, the Shiva form of the 34th tattva, visualizing him as a blazing corpse, emaciated in his transcendence of the lower universe, resonant with the mad laughter of destruction, gazing upwards to the higher light of the Trika's absolute. Now the practitioner visualizes the 3 prongs of the trident rising up from the navel of Sadashiva through the cranial aperture to spread out and up to the plane of the Dwadashanta. As they rise, they penetrate 3 levels: power, Shakti, the pervading, Vyapani, and the conscious, Samana. These are the higher levels of the resonance, or nada, of the rise of transcendental subjectivity, which was symbolized by the laughter of the blazing Sadashiva corpse. They are the substance, as it were, of the highest reaches of the Shiva cosmos, the oscillation of emanation and resorption of worlds, in ever vaster dimensions of time, in the ascending hierarchy of the cosmic breath, coming in the end to rest in timeless infinity with the conscious, Samana. Finally, he visualizes 3 white lotuses on the tips of the prongs of the trident, and equates them with the transmental level, Unmana, above that of the conscious. And this is the ultimate and final level, where the goddesses are enthroned. D. The supremacy of the Trika. Now that the 3 lotuses of the transmental, Unmana, are in place, in the upper limit of the rise of Kundalini, the Mandala throne is complete, and the Trika Shiva can proceed to the enthronement and worship of his deities upon the totality of the tattvas. He can do this in the certain knowledge that there can be no worship higher than that to which his initiation has entitled him. For the purpose of the installation of the mandala in the line of inner sensation is not simply the daily inculcation of a certain cosmic hierarchy. It encodes this hierarchy to reveal the Trika's supremacy by taking him through and beyond the mandala thrones of all other Shiva claimants to the worship and assimilation of absolute power. Thus, immediately after his description of the Trika throne, Abhinavagupta writes the following: in the Shiva Siddhanta, the throne culminates in the 9 powers of gnosis. In the Vama and the Dakshina schools, it is extended to incorporate Sadashiva. In the Brahmayamala, it rises above Sadashiva to end in the conscious, Samana. Here in the Trika, it goes even further, ending only in the transmental, Unmana. That is why the Malini Vijayotara Tantra calls this throne the Supreme. That's the end of part 1 of Mandala and Āgamic Identity in the Trika of Kashmir. There may be a part 2, if there's any demand for it. And I'd like to note that I made minor edits to Sanderson's article and altered his translations very occasionally in very minor ways on the basis of deep study of some of the sources that he references. I did my PhD dissertation on the subject of samavesha. So I spent years thinking about this word and looking at all its many usages in the primary sources. And in the original text of the article that I'm reading from in this episode, Sanderson translates samavesha as possession. And certainly, in the earlier phases of the tradition, samavesha did mean possession, but by the time of the material that's being discussed in this article, it came to be understood as immersion. And Sanderson actually addresses this shift in footnote 33 of the article, which I'll read to you now. Here, Abhinavagupta understands samavesha to mean not the act of being entered, but that of entering into one's true nature. However, this system also expresses the principle that agency resides only in the deity-self. We see evidence of the primary sense of the word samavesha in the ritual context, especially that of the Kaula. That the Rudra Shakti Samavesha, spoken of in the Malini Vijayotara Tantra, was originally understood as degrees of possession, that is, of being possessed, during initiation, is apparent from the sources such as the Urumi Kaularnava Tantra, and by comparing the Malini with the Kubjika Mata. Since possession has the same voice ambiguity as samavesha, I have used it throughout. So this is what Sanderson says about his translation of samavesha as possession. And he's absolutely correct, of course, that Rudra Shakti Samavesha did originally mean possession by the Shakti of Rudra, a beneficial possession, of course, such as we can still see in India today. So the West is not acquainted with the concept of beneficial possession, and that makes the word somewhat problematic. But even more important, most people aren't going to understand the grammatical point he made at the end of the footnote I just read, which says that possession has voice ambiguity. And what he means there is possession can mean the state of being possessed or the state of possessing. But I doubt that most listeners would think of that ambiguity when they hear the word, which for those who are conditioned in Western cultures and religions, it's really just not the right word. So I did write an entire PhD thesis on this exact subject. So I feel qualified to change the translation to immersion when I read Sanderson's article here. And again, let's remember that Utpaladeva and Abhinavagupta make explicitly clear that that is what they mean by the term. And the reason why that term continued to be used is because these states of immersion into the deeper nature of reality or into one's own true nature were indeed accompanied sometimes by somatic and energetic side effects, phenomena that bore a certain resemblance to the phenomena displayed in possession rites. So more about that in my dissertation. And just to explain why I make little edits to the article, but none of these edits change the meaning of a single sentence. And they are indeed minor and infrequent. So doing my due diligence with this verbal footnote.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember, you can always find out more about the tradition of non-dual Shaiva Tantra at tantrailluminated.org, where, if you wish, you can become a subscriber to our online learning portal, and you'll receive access to a vast number of recordings, including a comprehensive curriculum in tantric philosophy, tantric yoga, guided meditation, and much, much more. Music for the podcast composed and recorded by Ann Leader. Find her at annleader.com. Podcast produced by Grazia Tribulato. New episodes drop every week, and may all beings benefit.